you may hear her. You may hear her in the background. So this is also the reality when we're at home, our lives intrude. And so just centering that. So the first thing I want to sort of talk about here is a slightly bigger topic of what does learning and mean. And I know that, like, for myself as a teacher, I often have these perfectionist qualities. I suspect that if we ask the folks here, that many of us might have similar streaks, that we want everything to be right for our students. And I suspect also that we have students who might consider themselves perfectionists, and they want to make sure they get everything right. And the more I came to sort of accept that this is who I am and noticing this in students, it made me also realize we want to think about what is the value of making mistakes. How do we help students recognize that making mistakes is perfectly natural, and in fact, it is what you need to do to learn. You learn when you make mistakes, you reflect, you think about it, and then you're able to sort of rethink how you approached an issue. And with that, I want to start to normalize even how we do like online workshops. How do we do this sort of stuff? And I want to start off with actually a question here for folks to pop in. You have two options here. You can do either one or both. What is a way in which you have failed in teaching imperialism? Or if you don't feel comfortable sharing that, you could just share something that you find challenging in the chat box there. And these are going to help me sort of think a little bit about what I might want to highlight here in the chat. So please go ahead and pop things in there. This is great. Thank you, Margot, for jumping right in there. Okay. Content, resistance. I'm just looking at folks, what people, not enough sources, definitely. That's always a challenge I'm noticing. And I encourage other folks too, as you're looking at this, to take a look at the chat and see what your colleagues are putting in there, because often we have the opportunity to sort of learn from each other and think a little bit about that too. Angela, I can't even pretend to try to type a response to your message at the minute, but thank you. I saw it. Okay, so as people keep doing this, I want to add something here. I want to start off with a good example of a mistake. So the quote that you're seeing here is a famous quote from Gandhi. I don't even remember when I first saw this quote or how many times I've seen it. I've seen it so many times, like traveling around in India. And the way you see the quote quite often is the way it looks in the upper left of the slide. Freedom is not worth having if it does not include the freedom to make mistakes. And it was about a year ago, I was trying to actually find the original source for this quote. And I did what most people did. I Googled, and I found tons and tons of people who, or posted it on memes, all sorts of things. It just shows up everywhere, but no one ever had a source. Like, where did this come from? And so then I shortened it and I just Googled Gandhi and freedom is not worth having. And all of a sudden, there was the quote, the actual original source. It was written in the Young India publication that Gandhi was writing for. And it was published in March of 1931. It's a little tough, I know, to read the box text there on the bottom right, but that's the actual, Young India Journal. And the quote is a little bit different. It's freedom is not worth having if it does not connote freedom to err and even to sin. And I was thinking, wow, like this is crazy that the quote is there, and yet like people have chosen to reinterpret what Gandhi was saying and to use slightly less, I would say, religious language. And as I realized this, there's two things that came to me. One, this is why we go back to primary sources when we're teaching. That often what shows up in the edited versions, what shows up in textbooks might not be actually what was said at the time. And also, I just thought this is absolutely incredible that a quote about making mistakes is actually mistakenly quoted all of the time. And sort of that to me is really a good thing to sort of just put there out for all of us as teachers to see and to think about this for our students, that we are going to make mistakes and we're even going to repeat our mistakes sometimes. So in thinking about the mistakes folks made, I noticed a lot of people mentioning in terms of challenges, finding materials about resistance. I also noticed, certain places that are being mentioned more than others, different perspectives coming up. I wanted to mention a few of the things that I've noticed over the years from myself. And I think the first one is one I caught as well early on, this idea of the content. And I talk about this as the content trap, that there is so much material that we can talk about. And so we try to cram so much in. And all of a sudden, we start telling another story, another example, and we start watching students' eyes glaze over. They forget names, they get focused on dates rather than on the more significant aspects of what we might be talking about in reading. Another aspect is what I jokingly call conquest mania, that we get so focused on talking about the process of conquest. As I was doing some research for this online, I came across this activity here, and it actually was something I remember doing myself as a high school student, drawing in a map of Africa, coloring which European conquered which country, and writing in the date. And as I was thinking about this, I was like, what on earth is the point of having students do that? Who cares? That this obsession with focus on the conquerors and what they're doing. Another is something that I've written about before, this idea when you start talking about the pros and the cons, or the positives and the negatives of imperialism. Priya Satya published a really great article about this. Oh, I forgot to mention at the beginning, first mistake that I made here, perfect. At the end, everything that I'm quoting here, all of the images, all of the quotes, I will have a bibliography for you that you can get at the end. So you don't have to worry about trying to write things down. I've provided all of it for you. So anyways, this issue of the pros and the cons and how problematic this is, thinking about what that must feel like to students if they're being asked to say what is good, all right, or what is positive about imperialism, especially if they come from a family that grew up in a colonized country, okay? And so that, to me, is one of the really sort of things to be aware of. And then the last mistake I know that I'd made a lot when I started teaching about imperialism is I would give students sources written by Europeans, and there would be stereotypes or racist language in them. And we would just talk about it, and we all knew it was racist and we all knew it was wrong, but we didn't call it out at the time. And so I think it's important when we start teaching a new topic or introduce a new source to make a point of saying there's going to be this type of language in here. If students don't feel comfortable with it, you don't have to say it out loud. Each teacher can think about how they want to do this for themselves, but to not say anything about it, I think, is especially problematic. And so some way acknowledging that this language is in our sources about imperialism. Sorry. All right. So with that there, I want to shift into talking about how do we teach imperialism. And the first thing you'll notice there is I want to highlight new imperialism. Some of us as teachers might be familiar with this, but for our students, when you think about this, they are encountering empire all of the time. They learn about Roman Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Mughal Empire, the Mongol. And to them, as teenagers, they may not think about something being significantly different between the British Empire and, say, the Mongol Empire, other than which people are doing the colonizing. And so what we're talking about is a particular type of imperialism. Usually, I use the dates from about 1870 to 1940 as roughly the era for new imperialism. But the key thing here is this idea of new imperialism is more intensive and it's more extensive. And when I use these two terms, what I mean here is by extensive, the amount of territory covered by European colonialism was so much greater that the British or the French ruled over so much more territory just in terms of mileage than earlier empires and the distance between parts. And then the intensive part has to do with the way in which European and also American and Japanese imperialism affected the culture or the economy or the politics or the social structures of the places being colonized. That when we talk about those earlier empires like the Mongol, they didn't really try to change the culture or the economy all that much. They were happy just extracting some taxation and resources, some people. They're not trying to remake these societies. That's one of the things that really sets new imperialism apart, this very conscious and deliberate process of trying to remake the places being colonized. So the next big question to think about here are the voices that we choose to center. And I just pop over and just notice here, I really appreciate folks who are acknowledging, like making some of those mistakes before. It's always important to recognize we make mistakes all of the time. So in terms of thinking a little bit about the voices we center, the first thing I want to talk about here by voices are the types of the sources we use. And so we can think about, are we only using textual sources or are we also using visual sources as well? When I started teaching, focused far more on textual sources and only gradually realized how important it was to use more visual primary sources. It really helps the discussion in the classroom in terms of whether you're working full class discussions or in small groups. And when I say that, there's two ways I would often see this happening. One is like the quote unquote weaker students, and I'm using air quotes here. They often were ones who might do so much better with visual sources. But then the quote unquote stronger students, they got to see other students see things that they may not see because they're so focused on reading things real fast. And so this is why I use as many visual sources as possible to sort of open up the discussion for students. Secondly, you can just start to think about whose perspective in terms of the colonizer or the colonized. And on one level, like you look at that image on the left, and this is a board game trading with the colonies. Like it couldn't be more direct here, the way in which imperialism is being presented as a type of game. It's fun. It's something you can recreate. Or we can use the voice of the colonized. And so here we have an Egyptian political cartoon of a British and French soldier toasting their glasses of champagne as they stand over piles of corpses of Egyptians and Moroccans. And so the message is so quickly obvious to the students, like when we think about this. But then I also was thinking about this. There are far more people who are colonized than there were colonizers. Why are we choosing to focus on the sources written by the minority of people when the vast majority of people were colonized? And so it's another reason to try to rethink which sources we're using. And then lastly, when we're doing this, we want to think about how much we're talking as teachers versus the students talking. One of the drawbacks here of doing like a Zoom workshop is I'm talking a lot, but I appreciate folks who are able to chime in the chat. And when I would teach this, I try to give as many sources to students, whether working in pairs, working in small groups, or even whole class discussions, and just let them go at it. What do they see? And to work through this, how much can I get myself out of the center of the discussion and let the students speak? Because that dynamic of the colonizer and the colonized, it shapes how we teach. When we're teaching as a teacher, transmitting what we know to students, hoping they get it, okay, we're recreating a colonial power dynamic. And so the more that we can let students work through things on their own and try to figure things out and help here and there, we're undoing those colonial power dynamics in the classroom. So I apologize for putting this big block of text on the screen. One drawback to a virtual meeting, I can't hand out paper to the classroom. But usually with something like this, I will have students have a copy of it there and we'll be on the screen and we'll read it together. And we're just going to kind of see how this works here. And I'm a huge fan of having students read sources out loud before we talk about them. For many of the reasons I've already talked about, just sort of how it allows more opportunities for students to read it, to think about it. Some will read it quickly, some will take time. So I'm going to read this out loud here, and you can read it on your own and start thinking a little bit about it. There's a string of phrases about the English occupation of India, which the genius of the English people has stereotyped into account. Security from foreign aggression, domestic peace, suppression of dangerous rights, protection for women and children, equality of all classes before the law, diffused education and extended commerce, railways and public works, and other benefits of the undefined entity called civilization, introduced by a superior to an inferior race, whatever those words may mean. These are said to be the many blessings of English rule in that country. It is taken for granted in a general way that Englishmen saved India from anarchy and ruin and gave her order and the beginnings of civilized life. A great many good people on both sides of the Atlantic who get their knowledge from the usual sources honestly believe that she is very much better off with her present rule than she otherwise would be. But the truth is this: India has given to England wealth and fame. England has brought upon India penury and shame. Instead of being a means of civilization, English rule in India is almost an excuse to keep up barbarism in the 19th century. So this is written by Amrita Lal Roy in 1886. And I use this as a way to let students start thinking about the motives for imperialism. That instead of using a source, so for example, Jules Ferry talking about French imperialism, why not let someone who's being colonized explain what they perceive the motives to be? And when I do this, just simply ask the same question to everyone here. Why don't you write in the chat box what you think Amrita Lal Roy thinks are the motives.
Can you repeat the question or put it in the chat?
Yeah, sorry. So thank you. What are the motives in this source for English imperialism, according to Amrita Lal Roy? All right, so I'm seeing these here. Wealth comes up a lot. White man's burden, superior. All right. Yep. So you'll notice. Oh, I love this gaslighting India. So all of the things that probably most of us are familiar with as motives that show up in textbooks or other sources are popping up in this source. But instead of letting Europeans say it, we're letting an Indian person say what he sees as the motives. And what I also like about this source is one of the things Roy does is he says, well, this is what English claim to be the motives, but you'll notice towards the end, he points out it's really about wealth. Okay, that all of these claims about the civilizing mission, are trotted out. But the truth is this: India has given to England wealth and fame. England has brought upon India penury and shame. So it's a way also to let students think about, well, what might be the sum of the stated motives that Europeans using versus what are the ones that actually seem to be the ones that matter more, at least to someone who's being colonized. Leopold vibes. Yep. So that's one aspect in thinking about causes. The second part to thinking about the causes of imperialism is to think about what made imperialism possible. And I break these out for students because when we talk about the why, there's why they wanted, why Europeans wanted to colonize and why they were able to colonize. And to use these terms, motives and methods, and separate them, I find can be really helpful for students. So for this one, we have just a short little quote here from Ndansi Khumalo, who is from, present-day Zimbabwe. It was known as Southern Rhodesia in the late 19th century. And he is describing his participation in the Chimurenga, what is often called the Second Matabele War by the British. And the reason why I'm putting both of these names there is this is another thing that we can think about when we're teaching imperialism. What do we call the conflicts? What do we call the places that are being colonized? Do we use the names that the colonizers used, or do we use the names that colonized people and their descendants now use? What I try to do is I try to use the names that colonized people and their descendants use and put the other ones in parentheses. So it's a signal to the students, whose perspective are we trying to use here? And so this is a little opportunity to think about how we simply present material to students. So in this one, we get a really simple and direct explanation of why Europeans were able to conquer. We knew that we had very little chance because their weapons were so much superior to ours. I had a gun, a breech loader. They, the white men, fought us with big guns and Maxims and rifles. And so really clear, what is the reason Europeans are able to do this? Well, it's machine guns. We also can look at some of the images, depending on how big your screen is, to be able to see the image there. There is a picture of the Second Opium War. It was originally drawn by a Chinese participant, and then it shows up in an English periodical. And when we look carefully at this image, and we can let students sort of zoom in on this if they have laptops or really project it large, you'll notice there's 3 ships in the foreground. There's 2 large ships that are the English ships. One of them has the steam coming out of it. It's a steamship. The other is a much smaller Chinese boat. Easy for students to start to think about this here. When you look at the soldiers, one of the things that we can help students with is often an easy way to identify who is being drawn is by hats. That this shows up in so many images that we can often figure out who the Europeans are versus who the Chinese are by what they're wearing on their head. And you'll then, once you notice that, you'll notice the people with the European style hats have much bigger guns than the weapons that are often spears by the Chinese soldiers. And so again, another way to start to visualize what Daniel Hendricks calls the tools of empire. And so this is a classic text. He talks about weapons, he talks about railroads, talks about steamships, quinine, all of these sort of tools that make imperialism possible. And if you want, there's a really useful OER source about these tools of imperialism as well. So after thinking about the causes, the other main topic that I like to focus on with students is how do colonized people respond to imperialism? And so I deliberately use this term response more and more over the years because response can show up in many different forms. You can agree to do something is a response. You can say, no, I'm not going to do this. You can fight back. But what it does is it restructures how we're teaching about imperialism, whose agency is being at the center of this story. So in looking at this map, all right, we start to get one of the most typical forms of responses that's talked about is that there's resistance movements. And again, what words we use matter. Are these rebellions is often what Europeans called them, and therefore the people doing this are rebels in all of the connotations in that. Or do we want to call them uprisings, revolts, insurgencies? And so I love these sorts of maps here that show all of the anti-colonial uprisings. I say all, it's not all. It's only a small handful, because it allows students to start to visualize how frequently people fought back. That basically, if there was a place European colonized, there was a place that the colonized people resisted. And just being able to visualize that can really get students thinking about things in different ways. I agree. I would much rather have students draw in a map of all of the uprisings as well, Betsy. So another type of resistance can be the more subtle type, using, writings in newspapers by colonized peoples. I like to focus on art as a way that you can use resistance. One of the things that increasingly I'm realizing with lots of high school students is the idea of subtle, subversive art is not something that comes as naturally to them as to many of us as adults. A lot of the media that they consume is very in your face. So when I noticed my last few years of teaching, just using that word subversive, sometimes I would just want to ask students to think about what it means. So what you have here are 2 examples from Southeast Asia of using resistance. So on the right-hand side, what you're looking at there is a drawing made in Java of a self-liberated slave who has fled from Batavia, the Dutch territory, into one of the other parts of Java that is still ruled by the indigenous rulers. And the Dutch come to try to get him back, and this battle ensues. And what you're seeing here is the Dutch soldier is much larger and in red. The enslaved Javanese warrior is the one fighting him in white in the center, and he ends up killing the Dutch commander. And so this event actually happens in the early 18th century, but this illustration is made in the 19th century at sort of the height of Dutch colonialism. And so there's a very conscious decision to celebrate the killing of a Dutch officer by a Javanese soldier here as a way to sort of highlight earlier forms of resistance and to talk about these stories. So you're not fighting back directly, but you're talking about the idea of what resistance looked like in the past, what could be done. In the top right is a political cartoon from the early 20th century in Vietnam. And so Le Touyet is a popular figure in these cartoons. Usually he would be commenting on scenes in cities in Vietnam. So as Saigon and Hanoi are changing as cities, he often would be commenting on what people were wearing, the types of buildings, architecture, things like that, like wrestling with modernity. Occasionally, you would have these cartoons that would show up, which are very clearly commentaries on French rule in Vietnam. And so Le Touyet, who is the figure in black in the back corner, is watching another Vietnamese man being led in chains by a much larger French soldier and says, "How precious, Vietnam and France, and tightly bound in spirit." And so the message is really clear. Anyone seeing this, can understand the sarcasm dripping here in this cartoon. The last type of response that I want to talk about here is a slightly different one. And I'm going to take a moment here, and hopefully folks can read this for themselves there on the screen. They're looking at something big enough. And read through the way in which this French official is recommending to the Vietnamese emperor what to do about the French. And then in the chat box, write down what is his response, Nguyen Ba Nui response to French imperialism. And I will write this in the chat box here. Yep. So people are noticing right away that, he's making a choice to surrender. And one of the things that I like about this source is it takes conquest. And yes, the French are still conquering the Vietnamese, but now it's not just simply something that happened to the Vietnamese. It's something that they're choosing. We can't win. So the better option here for us is to surrender and sue for peace, to try to come up with some sort of better terms. And it's a way to kind of restructure whose agency are we centering when we're talking about imperialism. Also, I put into the chat there as people were writing, I was looking back at some of the ones, someone commented that me using the term the colonized is also a problematic term. And I agree, it's like saying the slaves in many ways. I could say colonized Africans, Asian, indigenous peoples, and Pacific Islanders every time, but I'm using shorthand here. Often when I talk about a single source with students, I will try to say, for example, the colonized Vietnamese, that you give some sense that they are humans who are being colonized rather than just simply calling them the colonized. All right, and then where did my cursor just disappear to? There we go. Okay, so you have that source. And then the last thing I want to highlight here are 5 other potential examples of sources that focus on the people who were colonized. Thank you, Linda. Their with different forms of response. So 3 of these sources are available through the OER project. One, very conveniently, responses to industrial imperialism, looks at a few different examples from around the world. The other 2, the one by Azizun of Lucknow and the graphic biography of Ya Asantewaa, are both examples of women who fought back against British colonization and led uprisings. These are great one-page graphic histories, and so you can use both of them really easily with students. Then the other 2 examples, my personal favorite of these 5 is Mike Vann's The Great Hanoi Rat Hunt. This is a longer source, but you can pick out a chapter. I can give you some recommendations later of sort of like which chapters I think are best. What I love this source is it highlights both like what the French are trying to do in terms of imperialism, and then how the sort of average Vietnamese living in Hanoi is like, this is absolutely stupid what the French want. They're dumb, and we can sort of use this against them. And it really is great for like thinking about the nature of imperialism and the way in which the Vietnamese responded and tried to take advantage of what they saw as French stupidity. And then lastly, the crash course episode from their 2nd season on world history, the Asian responses to imperialism. This is a bit more about kind of the ways in which different Asian philosophers and intellectuals were writing back against empire. And this one focuses a little bit more on intellectual history. All of these sources are ones that, you know, can easily be adapted for working with students. You can break them up different ways. I just wanted to show that there's like so many different resources here that you can start to use to think about the ways in which the people who are being colonized responded. And this is going to end like me talking to you time here. I want to thank you for like taking the time and listen here. If you have a phone and want to quickly jump to the resources, there's that link. I'm going to post the link in the chat here as well for the bibliography. And while I'm doing this, what I would like is if folks could take a minute in the chat to share something that you learned this evening, or to share some way you're looking at these materials and to think about how they can be used in your class. And we'll start off there before we open it up to questions. But I really think this is a great opportunity for us to learn from each other. I'm really curious to see how folks here might want to use these materials. Anna, the mentioning of individual stories, I think, is really key. Whenever I can focus on a person, I always like to have a single individual. Students can sort of envision a single person more than just the French, or the Vietnamese or Indians, by having those individual stories. The maps is great. Folks who have known me for a while know I'm a huge fan of collecting maps, and those resistance maps are always a great one to use. Angela, I've never used a graphic history.
I'm gonna kind of call out my colleague Kelly. I used to work with her at Venice High. I don't, Kelly, you can probably speak for yourself, but she told me of a great chat GPT prompt that she did um, to find out about resistance to colonization and get literature. And I don't know, Kelly, if you want to talk about it. I don't want to put you on the spot, but sometimes we don't even know what people or individuals or resources to look up, and ChatGPT can assist perhaps in that.
To that point, I have never been ashamed to talk about like how I use Wikipedia and Google with students. Like to find a person's name, the date, something like that. It's an incredible resource, just in the same way that ChatGPT can be as well. It's then what do we do with it? It's a good starting point. Okay. Repost the doc there. Yep, mine, there's notes there on Wikipedia as well. All right. So these are great ones to start having folks like look at. I encourage you to look at each other's responses. Now let's sort of go for questions. And let's look here. Is the setup here that you can raise your hand? I'm just trying to see that to ask a question. Can folks do that? No.
Should be able to under reactions.
Perfect. Yes, someone found it there. Great. And so let's talk a little here rather than me just talking. So Lauren, go ahead. And what's your question?
Hi, so I've been teaching history for a while, not very long, but I prefer project-based learning. And I like for the kids to kind of create their own questions and be inquisitive learners. And I'm trying to find something to help and to prompt the kids to where they could be more project-based or just kind of make more meaning, because I just feel like the kids are kind of numb these days, and trying to find something that's a little that would, I don't know, push them to want to learn. So I was wondering if anybody had any project suggestions.
A quick, easy one to do is actually if you use the map and you give that to the students, because it has all of these different uprisings on it, and you let students go off and research a little bit. What can they find out about each of these uprisings? Because the thing with the map is it's just a list of where there were rebellions, when they happened. It doesn't say anything about, well, what happened in that uprising? Was it led by a man or a woman? Where there's so many potentials there in terms of doing a little bit of research and project based. And that's one of the ways you can use that map. There's also another map of resistance in Africa that you can find on liberating narratives that can go down that route too. So that would be one way. If someone has some other resources that they want to share here and put in the chat that answer Lauren's question, please feel free to drop it in. Does my curriculum have a digital textbook? Yes and no. If you go to Liberating Narratives up there on the screen, that's the newsletter that I write every week. I send out one newsletter, plus on the 15th of the month is a free post for everyone that introduces the month's theme. So for example, the past month, I've been writing about Haiti. The last post on the Haitian Revolution will be coming out tomorrow. And then on Saturday, the next one's coming out. It's actually sort of rethinking how we teach industrialization. And so that's one place you can get it. A lot of the resources and materials that I showed were coming from OER. I tried to sort of highlight the ones that they had. Okay, Anna, what's your question?
Hey, yeah. So I teach seventh grade social studies in Indiana, and our curriculum is like the entire Eastern Hemisphere, ancient history to today. And something I really struggle with is just how to fit all the stories in. Like, is there, I don't know, any way to, when we talk about, like China, we get to Australia and India, then it gets to Africa at the end of the year, and everything seems so cramped. I'm pretty new too, so I'm not like, I haven't figured it all out yet, but When it comes to teaching about like Africa specifically, how to like, I guess, not lump everyone together.
So what you mentioned at the beginning, how to tell all of the stories, that to me right there is, I would just sort of say, as like the starting point. Like, we're never going to tell everything. Like, we can't. Yeah, like, don't even do it. And so I encourage teachers, like, choose carefully like which stories you want to tell. Like, think about the students that you have. If you have one community that's like overwhelmingly showing up where you live, I often try to find stories that would resonate more with them. At my school for a number of years, we taught Arabic. And so I wove in a lot more Middle Eastern stuff and thinking about, how to hit those students. Or like the other thing that, I will often say with thinking about how to identify stories is to go for a sort of balance, and to choose, okay, so we're doing the Eastern Hemisphere. Let's choose one place in Southeast Asia. Let's choose one place in Africa, or like maybe two places. I say, like, do one in West Africa, one East Africa, and be a little conscious, but keep coming back to those places. So you will notice I used a number of examples from Vietnam, and it was mostly because I realized early on that, like, I wanted to keep talking about Vietnam over the course of the year with the students, that I would use examples from, the period from like before 1450 to think about trade in the Indian Ocean and use Vietnam, then to think about French colonization, then to come back later and to think about the Vietnamese struggle for independence, first against the French and then against the Americans. So when thinking about which stories to include, try to do it so that you keep circling back to the same place. And that way it becomes more meaningful to the students. And you can even start off each time like, hey, what do we remember last time we talked about Vietnam? So that they can start to see a sort of through line through their instead of trying to hit everything or choose places at random. Any other questions that folks have? I'm looking here, see if there's anyone posted a question. Okay, Taylor, we'll go for it.
Hi. So this is a little bit of a different time period, but I also really like to cover Central and South America. And because it happened before the Scramble for Africa, should it be covered at the same time, or should it be covered separately? I mean, just in thinking about how to organize things.
So like how your class is set up. I mean, if you're teaching AP World, I would say don't cover Central American resistance, for example, at the same time this, if it's especially you're thinking about like the 16th century. If you're in a different context, maybe it does make sense to draw some parallels. And I think it just depends on what you're trying to do in your class. Like, do you want them to see the connections across time of resistance by people who were colonized? Or are you trying to sort of see what's happening at the same time in different parts of the world? I think that would be my initial suggestion. And then was there a second part to your question that I missed there?
Oh, no. It's just like, I think that's where I get really stuck, is trying to figure out, how do I cover what Spain in particular did, and how that's, different from the Scramble for Africa and everything that comes after, industrialization.
Yeah. No, it sounds like to me like I would try to keep it a little separate in that sense, to do it that way. I have written something. I can't find it right now while I'm doing this, but I wrote a post on the Bringing the Narratives about resistance by Indigenous folks to Spanish and Portuguese imperialism in the 16th century. And if you send me an email, I can happily like point you to where that is as well. I'll get to you in a second, Jennifer. Someone asked here if I have something for decolonization similar to this. And I am thinking a lot about sort of how to present that exact thing. Right now, my plan is for the next month, as I mentioned, I'll be writing about industrialization and mass production. And then beginning in October, I'm planning to spend like through mid-October through mid-December writing about decolonization. I did like a similar 2-month series on liberating narratives all about imperialism. So there will be more coming. And I will also, eventually figure out sort of like how to kind of really boil that down into a few clear themes. Jennifer.
Yeah, I have a question about specifically teaching Congo. I always have taught about when you teach Congo, I've discussed like Alice Seeley Harris and Roger Caseman and Edie Morell, who were Europeans who protested colonialism. And I'm wondering always if I should take their voices out in favor of solely African voices. I kind of like to know your take on that.
So even though I didn't mention, many Europeans by name here tonight, I always include sources by Europeans. So, for example, I included the source by Amrita Lalroy about British imperialism in India, and I mentioned Jules Ferry. And so I will often juxtapose, if I can find a short excerpt to use with students so that you have both. And I don't think that we want to like completely remove the European voices at all. I think it's actually really important for the students to see, oh, like this is what this white European dude said. This is what this Indian writer wrote back. The students will quickly realize, like when they compare this, that the Europeans might be saying they're doing one thing or why they're making choices about colonialism. And what's happening on the ground is quite different. And I think that's one of the reasons why to keep a certain amount of European perspectives in here. It's to me just a question of not doing all Europeans and how many, like what's finding a good balance. And you will know best for like your students what I think that balance ought to be. But definitely keep some, because you want students to see the racism at times that's there, that like it's really clear when you look at some of the sources that there's a lot of problematic views, and you don't want to pretend that that wasn't there. Any other questions that folks have?
There's one in the chat from Jeanette.
Okay, shouldn't there be a discussion of the economic systems, colonialism, mercantilism? Okay, so yes, I do think you want to talk about sort of the ways in which Europeans are extracting wealth and resources from the places that they're colonizing, and thinking a little bit about the economic systems. I also think that it can sometimes get bogged down in the economic side, and the individual stories get a bit lost. And so it's always going to be a sort of question that like, how much of this do you want to do? Right now, I'm like thinking a little bit about when we talk about the economic aspect of imperialism, how wealth gets extracted, it often gets presented as this is what Europeans did to these colonized peoples. How did they restructure their economies? How did they pull, wealth out of the places? And trying to think a little bit about how are there choices to be made on the part of the people who were colonized in terms of what are they going to do? Are they going to continue farming? Are they going to move to the city to try to find a better job? That we can do the economic stuff, but we want to figure out where do we, again, like allow the people who are being colonized to show their agency in the process, rather than just talking about like the different forms of economic imperialism and how wealth is getting extracted. I hope that gives a sort of way of how to sort of balance that.
I meant it primarily in terms of just framing it.
Okay.
The frame before we get into the notions of the narratives. So
Okay.
there has to be a frame set up, because previously when you were discussing it, you were talking about the differences between what the Spanish did in the 1600s versus the Scramble for Africa, and how do you draw those parallels? So that's why I brought up the economics, but we know that the economics, without the economics, none of the other stuff makes sense, because it's all about the economics. And so that's why I thought we should bring up at least it in terms of a frame.
Yeah, I mean, I think you could do that when introducing the causes, like that's an opportunity to talk about the structures and the framing, where it's coming from. Capitalism evolves over time. It's not the same in the 16th century and the 19th century. And so I think for me, as I'm thinking about that, like I might not have framed it in terms of imperialism per se, but it would have occurred in a different part of the class, thinking about what how the European economy is changing and evolving, and how Europeans are searching for more markets to sell their goods and more places to get resources from. Is that more along the lines of what you were thinking about there? Yeah. Okay. I hope a little bit helped.
I'll accept that for now.
Okay. I can keep thinking about it too. With everything too. It's always like a matter of sort of evolving and developing over time. Any other questions here? Suggestions for differentiation. Someone already mentioned there, the visuals in the cartoons. I also agree. Short excerpts, I will often at first start with a longer excerpt of a primary source, break it down, and I'll do an activity too, where sometimes I'll ask students to translate English into English, because often like the language being used is this very 19th century translation and terminology. And so that's one way to do, like sort of start off before you even talk about it. Like, tell me a different version of it. I even sometimes with like really intense sources will ask students if, like, depending on who they are, like write a haiku. Like, what's the short version of this where you just took this really intense source and do something really quick so that they get at the meaning. But I think the visuals is the best way to get at it, because when you pair the visuals with the textual sources, it really, I think, opens up opportunities. Did I get any other questions there? Can you see? What is this one here? I'm looking at Christine. Can you see more about that? Okay, I teach them together, imperialism and decolonization in one unit. That's a lot to get in there. Other questions? Anything else? If I missed something here, please put it again there. It's a phenomenon of over-labeling. Okay. So this is a great question, Betsy. Thank you. And I think you're right. Like, I don't think the majority of people that were colonized actively fought back. I think most folks often made peace with the situation that they found themselves in and figured out subtle ways that they might resist. It might mean, working, on some horrific farm in southern Rhodesia growing tobacco for the British who defeated you, but you drag your feet. That there's many types of forms of resistance. There's also figuring out how people did choose to sort of work with this. I didn't really highlight a lot of the examples of officials who, are serving in European governments throughout Africa and Asia. There's another way to do it. I gave the one example of the Vietnamese official who said, let's surrender because we're going to get destroyed if we fight back. But I do think there's definitely an opportunity there to create a whole wide range. I think in general, textbooks tend to have more examples of people who collaborated with European rulers. Like, you can't talk about British imperialism without talking about the Sepoys. The entire subcontinent of South Asia is basically conquered by Indian soldiers fighting for the British. And so you have that as another example as well. And so you're right, like, not everyone's resisting. A lot of people are choosing to go along. I think the reason why I focused here so much on the resistance is I think that's the area where, in general, we don't get enough background information. But I don't in any way want students to think that everyone is resisting, because they unfortunately we're not. Balance, definitely. What's your big picture takeaway that students should walk away? Oh, okay. Thank you, Ashley, for this question. Okay, my big picture takeaway. This is really kind of easy. And it's going to sound like kind of the hot take here. Europeans never conquered. Okay, that's the big picture. They wanted to conquer. Every single day, they were trying to enforce their will. And every single day, there are people, whether it's in India or if it's in Vietnam or if it's in the Congo, who are choosing to make their things difficult for the Europeans. They're, fighting back. And so what you have is this sort of brief moment where Europeans will claim that they conquered all of these places, but it's really relatively brief when you think about that time period. We're talking about less than 100 years in which Europeans attempt to impose their will on the people that they claim to have colonized, when in fact, it's really about Europeans trying to figure out how to just hold on control until the next day, or if you're a British official, until like you get to go back and drink your gin and tonic for the evening. It's that to me is the thing, that like you don't actually conquer. There's just simply an 80-year attempt to conquer and colonize. So that would be the big takeaway for there, that conquest never really happens. There's an incredible book that I'm blanking on the name, about the attempt by the French in the 1920s and 1930s to build a railroad, not in the Democratic Republic of Congo, the other Congo, Equatorial Congo, I think is what the French call it. The name is going to come to me in a minute, but basically this is like a 15-year struggle to build this railroad that they think is going to make colonization perfect. And it's just like completely a mess. And every day people are just walking off the construction sites, leaving and fleeing. And it really drives home that like conquest never really happens. You're just this continual attempt by the Europeans to try to impose conquest. And all of those colorful maps that we grew up with are a way to make it seem more real than it actually was. Yes, thank you, Jennifer. In the Forest of No Joy. That's the book. Not one that you're going to easily use with students, but it's a great book for thinking about imperialism. How do you introduce the idea that Europe never conquered? So that is a good question. I tend to do it at the end. I ask students to think about just simply the time frame. Like, when you think about empire and how long it lasted, this period of new imperialism, compared to, say, the Roman Empire. Like, you can ask students to just think about the relative brevity of the time in which Europeans ruled over some of these places. It's a big picture question that I like to do at the end. Open discussions. This is like the perfect type of question to use for a Socratic seminar or a Harkness discussion, like at the end of talking about imperialism. Like, did Europeans actually conquer? Like, let students debate it. Like, that's, I think, a possibility here, especially once the students have had an opportunity to look at a lot of material about resistance and responses. I think the students can come to that conclusion on their own. I think would be the best way, I would say, to get at this. How do you approach, we got that one already. What's war? Yes. Yep. The David Olusoga book is a good one. What would you include about the colonies when teaching about the world wars? Okay. Again, if you send me an email, I published a piece on liberating narratives either the last day of June or the beginning of July. I talked about this exact topic at the World History Association in June. I talked about the Southern Front, and I gave 3 examples of how we can just completely approach World War I in a whole new way, not by looking at what's going on in the Western Front, but by having students look at 2 sources that I talked mostly about what was going on with soldiers from French Senegal and a Parsi soldier from India who traveled all over. And then I even included some examples to others. Oh, sorry. The French Senegalese soldiers were the extra examples. The other one was a Palestinian soldier fighting in the Ottoman army. And so that would be what I would recommend to start thinking about colonies in the world wars. Is basically I use sources written by soldiers who came from colonized territories and to let them share their perspectives about it, that you can weave it right in. Thanks, Betsy. Any other questions that folks have? I really appreciate everyone who's popped stuff in there, good examples, who found the books that I couldn't remember the names of. Any other questions? Well, is the map of uprisings and incidents only available in the paper book you've linked? Yes and no. It is coming from that book. If you subscribe to Liberating Narratives, you can find a digital copy there that I'm not going to point you directly to. I try to use materials and cite where they're coming from carefully so that I'm not getting in trouble with any copyright issues. So I always only give a paragraph of things as well. So I don't know, if you look around on the internet and Google that exact title, you may or may not find it. Any other questions? All right, well,
awesome. Thank you so much, Bram. We appreciate it. Can everyone, let's give him some good vibes, some thanks. We love it.
Thank you, everyone.
Yes, and from us at OER, thank y'all so much for attending our first OER Presents. We'll send the information from the session out after, and then thank you for bearing with us today. There were some technical issues with Zoom, but we worked it out, and I'm so happy that y'all were able to join us. Next time it'll go much more smoothly, but thank y'all so much for everything, and thank you, Bram, once again.
Thank you.
Awesome.
All right. Equity Consulting Group. I'm seeing if I missed anything. What's oh, Kelly, this is such a longer question than I can answer in a minute. The short version real quickly is it's Eurocentric how we teach about industrialization. We just are when do they copy the British? How to think more broadly about mass production so we can incorporate the whole world into our story. That would be the short thing, but you can find out more later this week. All right. Thanks, everyone. Thank you.
Thank y'all. Have a great night.
Hey, Scott. Thanks for coming.